Jebediah Stone took a wife the same way he'd take a dose of bitter medicine quickly without ceremony, and with a grim certainty that it was a necessary poison. The woman standing beside him, Irina Vance, was a stranger bound to him, not by love or even liking, but by the will of a dead man. He married her to save his family's land, a duty paid in the currency of a loveless vow. He thought he was burying the last of his heart alongside his brother. He had no idea that this quiet, haunted woman was about to unearth a ghost from his own past and resurrect a hope he'd long since murdered and mourned. The dust of the Montana Territory had a taste to it, a gritty mix of earth regret and broken promises. For Jebediah "Jeb" Stone, it was the flavor of his life. He stood before the circuit judge, his best suit, feeling more like a shroud, the starched collar a hangman's noose. Beside him, Irina Vance was a statue carved from prairie marble, her face pale and unreadable beneath the brim of a modest bonnet. The judge, a portly man named Judge Miller, whose breath smelled of whiskey and stale tobacco, droned on. The words, "holy matrimony," felt like a blasphemy in the stark, sun-bleached office. This wasn't a marriage. It was a transaction, a deed signed in flesh and blood to settle the debts of his dead younger brother, Caleb. Caleb had been the son to Jeb's shadow, full of laughter, wild dreams, and a reckless charm that had ultimately been his undoing. He'd bought the Whispering Pines Ranch on a prayer and a handshake, borrowing heavily from Damian Croft, the slickest banker in Black Creek. Then a month ago, Caleb's horse had come back without him. They'd found him at the bottom of a ravine, his neck snapped. An accident, they'd called it. Jeb knew better. Caleb was a superb rider, but there was no proof of foul play, only a mountain of debt and a betrothed he'd left behind, Irina Vance. She had arrived in Black Creek 6 months prior, a woman with no family and a past she kept veiled. Caleb had been smitten, promising her the world. Instead, he'd left her with nothing, or worse than nothing. Damian Croft had made it clear. The loan was tied to Caleb, and with him gone the note was due. Unless the banker, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes, had proposed a solution. The agreement was for the Stone family. Croft had purred, stroking his silver-inlaid vest. "You, Jebediah, are a stone. Marry the girl, assume the debt, and I will extend the terms. The ranch remains yours. Refuse and I foreclose by week's end." It was a cage, and Damian Croft held the key. Whispering Pines wasn't just land. It was his father's legacy, the only place Jeb had ever known peace. He couldn't lose it. So he'd agreed. He'd met Irina for the first time in the town lawyer's office 2 days after Caleb's funeral. She was taller than he'd expected, with eyes the color of a stormy sky, and a stillness about her that was unnerving. He'd laid out the terms, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I will give you my name and a roof over your head," he'd stated, not looking at her directly. "The east wing of the house will be yours. You will want for nothing in terms of food or protection. In return, you will be my wife, in name only. This is a business arrangement to save my family's home. Nothing more." She had simply nodded, her gaze fixed on a point over his shoulder. "I understand," she'd said, her voice a low, steady whisper. "I have one condition." Jeb had braced himself. A demand for money, jewelry, a life back east. "I require the use of a horse and the freedom to ride into the town of Redemption Peak once a month. No questions asked. It was an odd request, but one he readily granted. What did he care where she went? "I now pronounce you man and wife," Judge Miller grunted, snapping Jeb back to the present. There was no kiss, no gentle touch. Jeb simply turned his jaw tight and nodded towards the door. The buckboard wagon was waiting outside, loaded with Irina's 2 modest trunks. The ride back to Whispering Pines was a study in silence. The squeak of the wagon wheels and the plodding of the horses were the only sounds between them. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She didn't look at him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon of rolling plains and the jagged teeth of the distant Beartooth Mountains. There was a strength in her profile, a resilience he hadn't anticipated. He'd expected tears or perhaps a simpering gratitude. He got neither. She was as unyielding as the land itself. Whispering Pines came into view as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The ranch house, a sturdy 2-story structure built of timber his father had felled, stood as a lonely sentinel against the vast emptiness. It was a good house, a strong house, but it was a house of ghosts now. He pulled the wagon to a stop. "Gus will take your things," he said, his voice rusty. He gestured to the east wing. "Your rooms are there. The kitchen is communal. I take my meals at sunrise and sunset. You're free to set your own schedule." He didn't wait for a reply, swinging down from the wagon and heading for the barn. He had fences to mend, cattle to check. Work was the only salve he knew for a wounded soul. As he disappeared into the deepening shadows of the barn, he felt her eyes on his back. For the first time, a sliver of doubt entered his mind. He had married her out of duty, a simple, cold transaction. But as he looked back at the solitary figure standing by the wagon, her form silhouetted against the dying sun, he had the unsettling feeling that nothing about this woman was simple at all. The days at Whispering Pines bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the relentless Montana sun. Jeb and Irina moved through their shared home like 2 ships passing in a fog, aware of each other's presence, but never truly connecting. Their arrangement held. Jeb rose before dawn, his day a long, punishing cycle of physical labor that left him too exhausted for thought. He'd find coffee already brewed and a plate of bacon and bread left on the stove. He ate alone at the massive oak table. His father had built the empty chairs, a constant aching reminder of all he'd lost. Irina was a phantom in his home. She was unnervingly efficient. The house became cleaner, the larder better stocked. She tended a small vegetable garden with a fierce dedication, her hands, which he'd assumed would be soft, becoming calloused and capable. She mended his torn shirts, leaving them folded neatly on his bed. She never spoke of these things, and he never acknowledged them. It was part of the transaction. Her silence was a currency he accepted without question. Yet he noticed things. Small, incongruous details. She would hum sometimes while working in her garden, a haunting, unfamiliar melody that would drift in through the open window and stop the moment she realized he was near. He saw her once, sitting on the porch steps, sketching in a worn, leather-bound book with a piece of charcoal. She drew the mountains with a deft, practiced hand, capturing their stark majesty in a way that surprised him. When she saw him watching, she snapped the book shut, a flicker of something panic annoyance crossing her face before her placid mask slipped back into place. Their only real interactions were with Gus, the old ranch hand who had worked for Jeb's father. Gus was a wiry man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that saw more than he let on. He'd taken to Irina with a grandfatherly warmth. "That wife of yours," Gus said one afternoon, as he and Jeb were reshoeing a stubborn mare. "She's got a quiet strength. Reminds me of your mother." Jeb grunted, focusing on hammering a nail into the hoof. "She's here to keep the bank off our backs, Gus. Nothing more. A man can tell himself a lot of things to get through the day," Gus mused, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Doesn't make 'em true. I seen the way she watches you when you ain't looking. Ain't pity, it's something else." Jeb ignored him, but the old man's words stuck like a burr under his saddle. True to their agreement, on the first Saturday of the month, Irina would saddle the gentle mare May and ride out, heading east toward the distant silhouette of Redemption Peak. She would be gone from sunup to sundown, returning dusty and tired, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond the long ride. Jeb's curiosity was a low, simmering fire, but he'd given his word. No questions. Their fragile, silent truce was shattered by the arrival of Damien Croft. The banker rode up one sweltering afternoon, his fine black suit an affront to the dusty reality of the ranch. He dismounted, with a condescending grace, his smile as thin as a razor's edge. "Jebediah," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Just making my rounds, checking on my investments." His eyes roamed over the ranch, lingering on a fence that needed mending, a barn door hanging slightly askew. Jeb's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "The ranch is fine, Croft." At that moment, Irina came out of the house, a basket of laundry on her hip. She froze when she saw the banker. For the first time since he'd met her, Jeb saw raw, unfiltered emotion on her face, a deep, visceral dislike that bordered on hatred. Croft's smile widened. "Ah, the lovely Mrs. Stone. Marriage suits you. Though I must confess I see a sadness in your eyes. Is this rough life not what my dear departed friend Caleb promised you? He was baiting them, trying to drive a wedge into the cracks he presumed were there." "Mr. Croft," Irina said, her voice dangerously calm, "you are not welcome here. This is my home now." The banker chuckled a dry, unpleasant sound. Is it merely a property I allow you to inhabit? Don't forget who holds the paper on this place, Mrs. Stone. A single missed payment, a single sign that this arrangement is not working, and this all goes away." He tipped his hat, his gaze lingering on Irina for a moment, too long. "I'll be watching." As Croft rode away, a cloud of dust in his wake, the tension between Jeb and Irina was a palpable thing. The unspoken rules of their coexistence had been violated. "What was that about?" Jeb demanded, his voice harsh. "The way you looked at him." Irina's composure returned her face, once again a placid mask. "He is a vulture. He preys on the misfortunes of others. He's the man who owns this ranch if I fail," Jeb shot back. "Your animosity toward him is a luxury we can't afford." Her stormy eyes flashed. "And your blindness to his character is a danger you cannot see. He didn't just want this land, Jebediah. He wanted your brother to fail from the start." She turned and walked back into the house, leaving him standing in the oppressive heat, the dust settling around him. Gus's words echoed in his mind. "It's something else." He was beginning to realize that the silent woman he had married was not a passive pawn in his bid to save his home. She was a player in a game he didn't yet understand, and her secrets, he suspected, ran deeper and darker than any ravine in the Beartooth Mountains. The chill of autumn began to creep into the Montana nights, a harbinger of the brutal winter to come. The confrontation with Croft had left a lingering frost between Jeb and Irina. The silence was heavier now, freighted with suspicion. Jeb found himself watching her more closely, trying to decipher the woman who bore his name. He was a man who understood cattle land and the predictable turn of the seasons. He did not understand Irina Vance Stone. One evening, driven by a restless energy, he decided to clear out an old storage chest in the attic, a task he'd been avoiding for years. It was filled with his mother's things, linens, lace, and memories he preferred to keep buried. As he lifted a stack of moth-eaten blankets, his hand brushed against something small and hard. He pulled it out. It was a small wooden horse, no bigger than his palm, carved from a single piece of pine. The ears were slightly uneven, the tail a little too short. It was crude, but he knew every notch and imperfection by heart. He had carved it himself 9 years ago. A wave of nausea and a pain so sharp it stole his breath washed over him. He sank onto the dusty floorboards, the wooden horse clutched in his hand, the walls of his carefully constructed emotional fortress crumbling to dust. He didn't hear Irina come up the stairs. He didn't realize she was there until she spoke, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "Jebediah, are you all right?" He couldn't speak, couldn't move. He could only stare at the toy, his world narrowing to that single agonizing point. She knelt beside him, her skirts whispering against the floor. She didn't touch him, but he could feel her presence, a quiet anchor in his storm of grief. She saw the horse in his hand, saw the raw agony on his face. "It belonged to my son." He finally choked out the words, tasting like ash. His name was Leo. And then the dam broke. For the first time in 8 years, Jebediah Stone spoke of the life he'd had before. Whispering pines before Caleb's death, before the all-consuming duty. He told her about Mary, his first wife, a woman with hair like spun sunlight and a laugh that could charm the birds from the trees. They had lived on a small homestead, further south, their life a simple, happy song. And they had a son, Leo, a boy with his mother's smile and Jeb's own startlingly blue eyes, a bright, curious boy who was his father's shadow. He loved horses more than anything, Jeb whispered, his voice cracking. "I carved that for his 4th birthday. He never let it out of his sight." He told her of the day the world ended. It wasn't a war party, not an organized attack. It was a splinter group of Comanche renegades, desperate and violent. They'd swept through the valley like a firestorm. He'd been miles away mending a fence line. By the time he saw the smoke and rode back, it was too late. The cabin was burning. Mary was gone. But Leo was simply vanished. There was no body, only the small, trampled tracks of a child being dragged away towards the north. "I searched for 2 years, Jeb said, his voice hollow, the attic shadows seeming to deepen around him. "I followed every rumor, tracked every lead. I rode until my horse gave out, and then I walked. I traded with the Crow, the Shoshone, even spoke with a white man who'd lived among the Comanche. Nothing. It was like he'd been swallowed by the plains. After 2 years, broken and bankrupt, he had given up. He had accepted the brutal truth. Leo was gone. Dead. He sold what was left of his homestead and came to Whispering Pines to help Caleb, burying his past so deep he thought it could never be unearthed. He finally looked at Irina. He expected to see pity in her eyes, the same uncomfortable sympathy he'd seen from others years ago. But he didn't. He saw a profound, gut-wrenching sorrow, an empathy so intense it startled him. Tears were silently tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. It wasn't pity. It was as if she was feeling his pain as her own. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. No one should have to endure such a loss. He didn't know how long they sat there in the dusty attic, the silence broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the eaves. For the first time, the space between them wasn't filled with suspicion or duty, but with a shared, fragile humanity. He had shown her the deepest, most broken part of his soul, and she hadn't flinched. She had simply borne witness. As she finally stood to leave, giving him his space, she paused at the doorway. Grief is a heavy burden to carry alone, Jebediah. He watched her go, the small wooden horse still warm in his palm. He had married her to save his ranch. He had seen her as a means to an end, a ghost in his house. But in that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, he realized Irina Vance Stone was the most real person in his life. And he had the unnerving feeling that her secrets and his long-dead past were somehow about to collide. The first Saturday of the next month arrived with a crisp, clear dawn. The confession in the attic had changed the air between them. A fragile truce had been declared. When Irina came to the stable to saddle May, Jeb was already there, checking a loose shoe on his own gelding. The trail to Redemption Peak can be treacherous this time of year, he said, not looking at her. Watch for rock slides near the pass. It was the closest he'd ever come to expressing concern. I will be careful, she replied, her voice soft. He watched her ride away, her back straight and determined. For the first time, her monthly pilgrimage felt less like an intrusion on his privacy and more like a mystery he desperately needed to solve. What secret was so important that she would ride for 8 hours alone into the mountains? Irina's journey was one she knew by heart. Every rock and twisted pine was a familiar landmark. Redemption Peak wasn't a bustling town like Black Creek. It was a small, quiet settlement, nestled in a high valley, built around a Catholic mission, the Mission of St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. She tied May's reins outside the sturdy adobe walls of the mission and pushed open the heavy wooden gate. The place was an oasis of quiet industry. Nuns in dark habits tended a sprawling garden, and the sound of children reciting lessons drifted from an open window. A woman with a kind, weathered face and intelligent eyes looked up from her work, weaving a blanket. Irina, we were expecting you, Sister Agnes said, her smile warm and genuine. It is good to see you, sister, Irina replied, the tension visibly draining from her shoulders. This was her sanctuary. He is in the library. He has been asking for you, Sister Agnes said, her eyes knowing. Irina made her way to a small, sunlit room lined with donated books. Sitting at a small table, a young boy was hunched over a piece of parchment, painstakingly copying letters with a charcoal stick. He was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with a wiry frame and a shock of unruly brown hair. When he looked up, his concentration broken by her entrance, his eyes were a startling, piercing blue. Irina, he said, a rare, bright smile lighting up his serious face. He ran to her, and she knelt to embrace him, holding him tightly. Hello, Nodin, she whispered into his hair. This was Irina's secret. This was the reason for everything. Nodin. His name meant wind in the Shoshone dialect. He had been brought to the mission 4 years ago by a Shoshone woman. She had found him wandering alone in the foothills, half-starved and mute with shock. He had a faded, puckered scar on the back of his right hand, and he clutched a small, crudely carved wooden toy. He couldn't remember his name or where he came from. The trauma had stolen his past. The Shoshone had called him Nodin, and the name had stuck. Irina had been working as a lay helper at the mission back then, having fled a difficult life back east. She had been drawn to the quiet, haunted boy. She saw a kinship in his lostness. She spent hours with him, patiently teaching him to speak again, to read, to trust. And as she did, she vowed she would find his family. When her meager savings ran out, she had traveled to Black Creek, seeking work. That's where she met Caleb Stone. He'd been charmed by her story, by her quiet determination. He was a man of grand gestures and impulsive promises. A boy with no name deserves a champion, he had declared. When we are married, Irina, I will use my resources, my connections. We will find his people. I swear it. It was that promise, not love, that had made her agree to marry him. He was her means to an end, a way to fulfill her vow to Nodin. She had never told Caleb the boy's full story, only that she was the guardian of a lost child. She had certainly never known about Jebediah or his own lost son. But now everything was different. As she sat with Nodin, watching him trace the letters of his name, her mind reeled. Blue eyes, a lost son named Leo, a wooden horse carved by his father, a boy of the right age found wandering alone 4 years after the raid. The details Jeb had shared in the attic weren't just a tragic story anymore. They were pieces of a puzzle, and they were clicking into place with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty. She looked at the scar on Nodin's hand, a faint white starburst. Jeb hadn't mentioned a scar. It was a small detail, but it could be the one that shattered this fragile hope. "Nodin," she said gently, "can you tell me again how you got the scar on your hand?" He looked down at it, his expression clouded. It was a story he'd told her before, a fractured, dream-like memory. "Fire," he said softly. "The big fire. At the house. I was reaching for the little horse, the one Appa made. It fell near the hot iron. I fell. Epa, the word he sometimes used for father in his muddled memories. Irina's heart hammered against her ribs. A branding iron. A ranch. It was too much to be a coincidence. Her promise to Caleb had been to find a nameless boy's family. But what if she was on the verge of fulfilling a promise to a different brother? What if she could give Jebediah Stone back the son he thought he'd lost forever? The weight of the possibility was immense. This wasn't just hope, it was a potential miracle. But a miracle wrongly presented, a hope falsely given, could destroy a man like Jebediah completely. She rode back to Whispering Pines as the sun set the secret she carried, now heavier than any mountain. Irina returned to the ranch under the cold light of a full moon, her mind a maelstrom of fear and hope. How could she possibly tell him? The words seemed impossible to form. "I think I've found the son you believe is dead." It sounded like madness. Jeb was a man built on a foundation of hard, brutal facts. A half-remembered story from a traumatized child was not a fact. It was a flickering candle in a hurricane, and presenting it to him felt cruel. For a week she held the secret in a burning coal in her chest. The change in her was palpable. She was distracted, her usual calm shattered by an inner turmoil. She would stare at Jeb during their silent meals, tracing the lines of his face, seeing the echo of them in Nodin's features. The resemblance now that she was looking for it was undeniable. The same determined set of his jaw, the same piercing blue eyes. Jeb noticed the change, her distraction, her furtive glances. His fledgling trust began to wither, replaced by the familiar sting of suspicion. He thought of her secret trips, her guardedness. The wound Croft had opened began to fester. What was she hiding? Was she in some kind of trouble? Was she plotting with someone? His paranoia was given a voice by Damien Croft. The banker, true to his word, had been watching. He'd had one of his men follow Irina on her last trip to Redemption Peak. Croft chose his moment, perfectly riding up to the ranch when he knew Jeb would be alone, mending a corral fence. "A word of advice, Stone," Croft said, not dismounting, looming over Jeb from his saddle. "As your benefactor, I feel it's my duty to warn you. A man should know what his wife is up to." Jeb stopped his work, his hammer held tight in his hand. "Speak your piece and be gone, Croft." "Your wife," Croft said with a malicious grin, "seems to have a fondness for the mission of St. Jude, and more specifically for a child there, an orphan boy, spends the whole day with him. Touching, isn't it? One has to wonder about the nature of her charity. A woman with a secret child. It could prove embarrassing. Complicate matters of inheritance, wouldn't you say? The poison hit its mark. A secret child. It explained everything. The trips, the secrecy, the sudden change in her demeanor. The story she had told him in the attic. Her tears, her empathy. It felt like a lie. Now a performance, to gain his trust, while she hid this monumental secret. A cold, black rage born of betrayal flooded through him. He was waiting on the porch when she came out of the house that evening. His posture was rigid, his face a mask of thunder. "You've been lying to me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Irina froze the basket in her hands, slipping. "Jebediah, what are you talking about? Redemption Peak." He bit out the words. "The mission? The orphan boy? Croft told me everything." Her face went white. Of all the ways this could have come out, this was the worst. "It is not what you think." "Isn't it?" He roared, his control finally snapping. He strode toward her, his fury a physical force. "All this time, the secrets, the lies. You have a son hidden away up there, a bastard child you kept from me, from Caleb." The accusation, so vile and so far from the truth, broke through her fear. Her own anger rose to meet his. "You will not speak to me that way," she cried, her voice ringing with a strength he'd never heard. "You know nothing." "Then tell me!" He shouted, his face inches from hers. "Tell me the truth for once in this damnable arrangement. What are you hiding from me, Irina?" Pushed to the absolute brink with no other choice, the words tumbled out a torrent of desperation and conviction. "He is not my son. I think he is yours." Jebediah recoiled as if struck. He stared at her, his blue eyes wide with disbelief and raw fury. "What devil's game are you playing? Have you gone mad? Listen to me," she pleaded, grabbing his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "His name is Nodin. He was brought to the mission 4 years ago. He was found wandering alone after a raid. He doesn't remember his name, but he has blue eyes, Jebediah. Your eyes. He's the right age." Jeb shook his head, a pained, desperate denial. "Stop! Don't you dare do this! Don't you dare play with that!" "He has a horse," she pressed on, tears streaming down her face now. "A little wooden horse, his appa carved for him. He keeps it with him always." Jeb's breathing hitched, but his face was still a storm of doubt. A coincidence. "He has a scar," she cried, her voice breaking. "On his right hand, he told me he got it when he was little. He fell near a hot iron at his house when he reached for his toy, Silence." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and absolute. A branding iron. A detail so specific, so mundane, so deeply embedded in the life of a rancher's son. A detail she could not have known. He remembered it with sickening clarity. A spring day, the smell of burnt hair and hide in the air. 4-year-old Leo, always underfoot, had tripped near the branding fire. Jeb had snatched him up, but not before the boy's hand had grazed a discarded iron. He remembered the boy's cry, the small blister that had formed the resulting scar. He had never told anyone that story. Not even Caleb. He looked at Irina. Truly looked at her. He saw the desperate sincerity in her tear-filled eyes, the conviction in her trembling body. This wasn't a lie. It wasn't a trick. It was the most terrifying, impossible truth he had ever faced. The rage drained out of him, replaced by a dizzying, terrifying vertigo of hope. A hope so fragile, he was sure it would shatter him into a million pieces, where he whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Where is he?" "At the mission," she said, her voice barely audible. "At Redemption Peak." Dawn broke cold and grey, mirroring the turmoil in Jeb's soul. They saddled the horses in silence, the air between them charged with the magnitude of what lay ahead. This was not just a journey across the mountains. It was a pilgrimage into the heart of a buried past, a desperate quest for a ghost. The ride was long and arduous. For the first few hours, neither spoke. The rhythmic clopping of hooves on the rocky trail was the only sound. Jeb rode slightly ahead, his shoulders set in a line of unbearable tension. He was a man at war with himself. A part of him, the logical, grieving part that had spent years cementing the fact of his son's death, screamed that this was a fool's errand. It was a cruel twist of fate, a coincidence that would only lead to a deeper, more profound heartbreak. But another part of him, a part he thought long dead, was unfurling like a dormant seed in the spring. The hope was an agonizing physical sensation, a painful tightening in his chest. The scar. It all came back to the scar. As they stopped to water the horses at a mountain stream, Irina finally broke the silence. "I should have told you sooner," she said, her gaze fixed on the rushing water. "I was afraid. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of what it would do to you." Jeb turned to look at her. The anger was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice quiet. "From the beginning." And so she did. She told him about her life before Black Creek, about finding Noden, at the mission, the vow she had made to him. She told him about Caleb's promise, and how it was the sole reason she had agreed to a life she never wanted. Her story wasn't one of deception, but of a fierce, quiet loyalty to a lost child. He listened, and for the first time he understood the depths of the woman he had married. She wasn't just a part of a business transaction. She was a person of profound character and strength who had been fighting her own lonely battle all along. "I never knew," he said the words in admission of his own blindness. "I saw you, but I never saw you. We were strangers, bound by loss." She replied, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "Perhaps we had to be." As they rode on, the conversation continued hesitant at first, then flowing more freely. He told her more about Leo, about his favorite games, his mischievous laugh, the way he'd scrunch up his nose when he was concentrating. He spoke of Mary not with the raw agony of the attic, but with a gentle reverence. He was unburdening himself, sharing the weight of his grief with the one person who had, by some impossible twist of fate, become entwined in it. In turn, she spoke of her own lonely childhood, of her dream to one day have a family that was chosen, not just inherited. They were no longer just a man and a woman on a desperate errand. They were two broken people finding solace in their shared journey, the walls between them finally irrevocably crumbling down. The mission of St. Jude appeared in the late afternoon, its adobe walls glowing warmly in the slanted light. Jeb's heart pounded in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to flee from the potential devastation of being wrong. He glanced at Irina. She met his gaze, her eyes full of a steady, unwavering belief. She was his anchor. He dismounted, his legs unsteady beneath him. Sister Agnes met them at the gate, her expression cautious, as she took in the tall, intense stranger beside Irina. "Sister," Irina said, her voice trembling slightly. "This is my husband, Jebediah Stone. We have come to see Noden." Sister Agnes's wise eyes moved from Irina to Jeb, seeing the desperate hope and terror warring on his face. She nodded slowly. "The boy is in the chapel. He likes to look at the colored glass in the window when the sun is low." She led them across the quiet courtyard to a small, simple chapel. The air inside was cool and smelled of old wood and candle wax. And there, sitting on a wooden pew, his small form silhouetted against a stained glass window, depicting a shepherd, was a boy with unruly brown hair. He turned as they entered, and Jeb's world stopped. It was his son. Older, thinner, his face carrying a solemnity no child should have, but it was him. The years fell away. It was Leo. The same jawline, the same way his hair curled behind his ears, and the eyes were the same piercing blue as the ones that stared back at him from his own reflection. Jeb took a hesitant step forward. The boy shied away his gaze, wary, clutching something in his pocket. He was a stranger to this man. Jeb's throat was tight, his voice a dry whisper. Leo. The name meant nothing to the boy. He just stared, his blue eyes wide with uncertainty. Jeb's heart cracked. This was his son, but he was a stranger. He had lost him all over again. Seeing the fear in the boy's eyes, Jeb stopped. His first instinct was to rush forward, to sweep the child into his arms and never let go. But he saw the stranger in front of him, a boy who had survived a world of trauma, and he knew that would only terrify him. He looked at Irina, a silent plea for help. She gave a slight, encouraging nod. Slowly, Jeb sank to his knees, making himself smaller, less threatening. The stone floor was cold against his shins. He didn't speak the boy's old name again. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat, his hand trembling. He pulled out the small, crudely carved wooden horse. He held it out on his open palm. I knew a little boy once, Jeb said, his voice thick and gentle, barely more than a whisper. He loved horses more than anything. His father, his Appa, carved him a horse, just like this one. It wasn't a very good horse. One of its ears was a little crooked. The boy Nodin stared at the horse in Jeb's hand. His own small hand tightened on the object in his pocket. His gaze flickered from the horse to Jeb's face, a glimmer of confusion, of something ancient and deeply buried stirring in his blue eyes. The little boy and his Appa would race their horses. Jeb continued, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. The little boy had a smaller one, a colt. The Appa had the mare. They'd race them across the floor of their cabin, making whinnying sounds. As Jeb spoke, Nodin's hand slowly, hesitantly came out of his pocket. In his palm was another wooden horse. It was smaller, darker with age, and the oil from his skin, its features worn almost smooth. It was a perfect match to the one Jeb held. A colt for his mare. The boy looked from the toy in his hand to the toy in Jeb's, and then up at Jeb's face. A memory fractured and distant was struggling to break through the fog. The smell of wood smoke. A deep, laughing voice. The feeling of being safe. Appa. The boy whispered the word, a question, a memory, a prayer. The sound shattered Jebediah stone. A sob, raw and ragged, tore from his chest. He didn't move, didn't want to break the spell. He just nodded, unable to speak, tears flowing freely down his face. Yes, Leo. It's me. The boy took a tentative step forward. Then another. He stopped just before Jeb, his small hand reaching out not for the horse, but for Jeb's face. He laid his small, scarred hand against Jeb's rough cheek, and in that touch, 8 years of loss, grief, and lonely darkness were vanquished. Jeb gently wrapped his arms around his son, burying his face in the boy's hair, and held him. He was home. They returned to Whispering Pines, not as two strangers and a boy, but as a family. The journey back was filled with a quiet, wondrous joy. Leo, and he was Leo, now sat before Jeb on the saddle, his small body, a warm, solid, miraculous presence. He was quiet, but he would occasionally point at a hawk or a deer, and Jeb would tell him its name, rebuilding their world one word at a time. Irina rode beside them, a quiet smile on her face. Seeing Jeb with his son, seeing the hardness melt away from him to be replaced by a tender, overwhelming love, she felt a profound sense of peace. Her duty was done. But as she watched them, a new feeling began to bloom in her heart, not of duty, but of belonging. Their arrival at the ranch was a new beginning. The house, once a tomb of ghosts, was filled with the hesitant sounds of a child's life. Gus wept openly when Jeb introduced him to his grandson. The final piece of the past fell into place a week later. Damien Croft, arrogant and unaware, rode up to the ranch to apply more pressure. He found Jeb on the porch oiling a saddle. Leo was sitting on the steps, carefully trying to carve a piece of scrap wood with a dull knife. "Stone." Croft began, his voice oozing false concern. "I trust you've dealt with your wife's complication." Jeb rose slowly. He was a different man from the one Croft had last seen. The haunted, broken look was gone. In its place was the calm, unshakable certainty of a man with everything to fight for. "My son's name is Leo," Jeb said, his voice level and cold as iron. "And my wife, Irina, is the woman who brought him home to me. You used my brother's death and my grief to try and steal my land. You are a vulture, Croft. You are no longer welcome here. The next time you set foot on Whispering Pines, I will consider it trespassing." Croft, seeing the look in Jeb's eyes and the unexpected presence of the child, was momentarily stunned. He opened his mouth to bluster, to threaten, but the words died on his lips. He had lost his leverage. He had tried to break a man who was already broken, never imagining he could be made whole again. With a final hateful glare, he turned his horse and rode away for good. That evening, as the sun set, painting the mountains in hues of gold and rose, the three of them sat on the porch. Leo, tired from a day of rediscovery, leaned against his father's side, half asleep. Jeb reached out and took Irina's hand, her fingers laced with his, a natural, easy fit. "You once said I was blind," Jeb said softly, looking at her. "You were right. I was looking at you, but all I could see was my own pain. I don't know what I did to deserve the grace you've shown me." "We saved each other, Jebediah," she replied, her stormy eyes soft in the twilight. "You gave me a home. I just helped you find what was already in it." He looked at the woman beside him, his wife bound to him first by a dead man's promise, and now by a living miracle. He looked down at the son he thought he'd lost forever, now safe in the circle of his arm. The vow he had made in bitterness and grief had been transformed. The marriage born of duty had against all odds become a marriage forged in love, a family built not on perfect beginnings, but on the beauty of their scars. The first few weeks of Leo's return were a fragile, sun-drenched dream. The Whispering Pines ranch, so long steeped in silence and sorrow, began to breathe again. The sound of a child's hesitant laughter was a melody Jeb had never thought he'd hear again, and it was sweeter than any rainfall after a long drought. Leo was a shadow at his father's heel, his wide blue eyes absorbing the daily rhythms of the ranch, the smell of the hayloft, the lowing of the cattle at dawn, the patient strength of Gus's gnarled hands as he taught him how to braid a rope. For Jeb and Irina, a new and delicate dance began. The invisible line that had divided the house in two began to blur. They started taking their meals together, the three of them at the great oak table. The conversation was often simple, centering on Leo's discoveries, but beneath the surface a deeper connection was being woven. Jeb would watch, mesmerized, as Irina gently corrected Leo's grip on a fork or told him a story about the constellations, her voice a low, soothing balm. He found himself seeking her out not from duty, but from a genuine desire to share the small wonders of his resurrected life. Their hands would brush as they reached for the coffee pot, a touch that lingered with unspoken meaning. The marriage contract had been fulfilled, but the marriage itself was just beginning. The dream, however, was shattered by a thunderstorm. It rolled in from the Beartooth Mountains, without warning, a violent behemoth of bruised purple clouds and roaring thunder. The first crack of lightning split the sky, followed by a clap so loud it shook the windows in their frames. Jeb, who was inside, showing Leo how to polish a saddle buckle, saw the change instantly. The boy's newfound light vanished extinguished. His body went rigid, his face paling to a ghostly white. He dropped the buckle with a clatter and scrambled away, crawling under the heavy oak table and pulling his knees to his chest. "Leo," Jeb said, his voice gentle as he knelt down. "It's just a storm, son. You're safe here." The boy didn't respond. He was trembling violently, his eyes squeezed shut, his hands clamped over his ears. He began to rock back and forth, muttering a word over and over, a name from a life Jeb wasn't part of. Nodin. Nodin. A cold fear gripped Jeb. He reached a hand toward the boy, but Leo flinched away as if struck. "No, go away!" he cried, his voice thin and panicked. It was the terrified cry of a trapped animal. Irina rushed in from the kitchen, her face etched with concern. She took in the scene at a glance, Jeb kneeling, his face a mask of hurt confusion. The boy lost in a prison of fear. "Let me," she whispered to Jeb, her hand gently on his shoulder. Jeb recoiled slightly, the rejection from his son stinging him. "He's my son. I should be able to comfort him." "You are," Irina said, her voice firm but kind, "by giving him what he needs right now. He isn't rejecting Leo's father. He's running back to what Nodin knew. Let me talk to him." Reluctantly, Jeb backed away, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He watched as Irina, without a word, slid under the table to sit opposite the boy. She didn't try to touch him. She simply sat in the darkness with him, a quiet, unwavering presence against the raging storm. "Nodin was very brave," Irina said softly, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. "I remember Sister Agnes telling me how he would help the younger children when they were scared. He would show them how to make shadows on the wall to look like rabbits." The boy's trembling lessened slightly. He peeked at her through his fingers. "Nodin knew how to find the best berries," Irina continued in that same calm tone. "And he could sit so still that the birds would come and eat from his hand. He survived the wind and the cold. He was a strong boy." Jeb watched his throat tight. He had been so focused on reclaiming Leo, on erasing the lost years, that he had never once considered the boy who had lived them. He wanted to give his son back the life that was stolen, but in his haste, he was trying to tear away the only life Leo could remember. Irina wasn't trying to coax Leo out of the darkness. She was honoring the strength of the boy who had survived it. After a long while, the storm began to pass, the thunder rumbling its way east. Leo's rocking slowed and finally stopped. He lowered his hands from his ears and looked at Irina, his blue eyes filled with a heart-breaking weariness. "Sometimes," he whispered, "I forget which one is me." "You don't have to choose," Irina said, her voice catching. "Nodin's bravery and Leo's heart are both inside of you. They make you who you are." She finally reached out and gently brushed the hair from his forehead. This time he didn't flinch. Later that night, long after Leo was asleep, Jeb found Irina on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the storm-washed sky. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he stood beside her. I was trying to bury Nodin. I see now that would be like burying a part of my son all over again. He has two pasts, Jebediah, she said, turning to him. He needs help weaving them together, not cutting one away. He looked at this incredible woman who understood the intricate map of his son's scarred heart better than he did. The gratitude he felt was so immense it transcended words. It was a feeling that settled deep in his bones, a sense of rightness, of coming home. He reached out his calloused hand, finding hers, and gently pulled her to her feet. He didn't speak. He simply looked into her stormy eyes, and for the first time, he let her see everything, the depth of his love for his son, the breadth of his admiration for her, and the burgeoning, undeniable love he felt for his wife. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion or desperate need. It was a kiss of quiet reverence, a thank you, a promise, a beginning. It was the sealing of a bond forged not by a judge's decree, but by shared trials and a healing love. When they broke apart, the space between them was gone forever. The east and west wings of the house had finally met. They were no longer just a man and a woman fulfilling a duty. They were a husband and a wife, ready to face the echoes of the past together. And so, on the vast, unforgiving canvas of the American West, a family was not born, but reforged. Jebediah, Irina, and Leo's story reminds us that even in the deepest darkness of loss, a flicker of hope can survive. It shows us that sometimes the duties we resent become the doorways to our greatest blessings, and that the strangers we are forced to accept can become the family we were always meant to find. Their home was no longer a place of ghosts, but a sanctuary of second chances, proving that the most powerful bonds are the ones we choose to build from the broken pieces of the past. If this story of love, loss, and redemption touched your heart, please take a moment to give this video a like to help it reach others. Share it with someone who loves a story of hope against all odds. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the heart of the Wild West. Thank you for listening.